So younger children often compare their Legos with each other or baseball cards. Adults sometimes share recipes or gardening tips, even great articles to read. But rabbis have these kinds of conversations. Rabbis say to each other, "Hey, how many Gilman books do you have on your shelf? You have 5 Gilmans, well, I have 6 Telushkins." These are the nerdy conversations that we have even while we're in rabbinical school. But there's an expectation. All of us, we all have several Rabbi Harold Kushner books on our shelves because every rabbi needs a rabbi. As the Jewish Telegraphic Agency put it, Rabbi Harold Kushner was often identified as the author of Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, when the correct title of his best-selling 1981 book is actually When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Because we never know when something might happen. When tragedy strikes, how do we cope? What do we do? And this theologian, this rabbi of rabbis who offered comfort through the beauty of his words, he just passed away at the age of 90 years old. And so this morning, I wanted to take a few minutes to offer 3 life lessons b'shem omro, taught in the name of Rabbi Harold Kushner. Many of you know his story. Rabbi Kushner's daughter, Ariel, was born right at the time his son Aaron turned 3 years old. Aaron had a host of health complications, and it would take pediatricians some time before they finally diagnosed him with progeria, better known as rapid aging. So the news was devastating, to say the least, and Rabbi Kushner remembers saying over and over again when he heard this news, "This can't be happening. This is not how the world is supposed to work." And throughout his book, thinking about his son who died prematurely, thinking about the many calamities in his own life and as well in the lives of his congregants, after much theological and spiritual wrestling, Rabbi Kushner ultimately concludes, God is not responsible for life's tragedies. But he does determine the following, and this is the first Kushner lesson I offer this morning. He writes, how does God make a difference in our lives if God neither kills nor cures? And Kushner teaches, God helps by inspiring people to help. It sounds simple, but it's not. He explains that it's God that inspires human beings to choose professions like doctors and nurses, caretakers, teachers. In other words, the helpers. It's God that motivated a man to make a tennis racket to fit Kushner's son's tiny hand so that his ailing son would still get the chance to play the sport that he loved the most. It's God that strengthens someone's heart through the mere action of a human embrace. It's God, believe it or not, that encourages us to make a minyan or reach out and offer a phone call or even send a note to someone who is in pain or someone who is grieving. Kushner writes, as a 19th century Hasidic rabbi once put it, human beings are God's language, which all stretch to mean that when we choose to do acts of loving kindness, small or big gestures alike by extension, God's poetry sings throughout the world. Kushner lesson number 2. After 9/11, Kushner was interviewed and questioned by various journalists who asked, where was God? How could God possibly let this happen? Because he was the God guy. And he responded, God's promise was never that life would be fair, But God's promise was that when we confront the unfairness of life, we would not be alone, for God is with us. Kushner said he found that answer in Psalm 23. For in the middle of the psalm, the psalmist writes, God restores my soul. For we know at different points in our lifetimes, our soul is depleted through world crises, through personal suffering, but even through the constancy of work. Being tied to our phones and to our screens, we often lament, I'm just so tired. But Kushner reminds us that God is here to replenish, to rejuvenate, to restore our souls. We are not alone in this hustle culture of the world, but rather Kushner reminds us that when God was busy creating the world, what did God do? God stopped. God paused. Yinafash. God restored God's soul. But you have to listen to that language. That God's soul was only restored when God was willing to stop. Which means God will only restore our souls when we're willing to stop. When we're willing to pause, that's when we let our spirits revive through conversation, through play, through Shabbat. But here's the secret. God can't be with us if we're constantly running through this life. God needs us to slow down so God can catch up. As the Kutzker Rebbe puts it, where does God dwell? God dwells wherever we let God in. But I take an extension of that. Where does God dwell? God dwells wherever we stop, wherever we pause to let God in. And finally, Kushner lesson number 3. He writes, don't be afraid of being afraid. Don't be afraid of being afraid. Because he says this world is impossible to control. We can each name a litany of frightful factors that would cause us to close our doors, shut our windows, and stay inside. But he says, don't deny your fear, master your fear. And in mastering your fear, you just might be able to appreciate and live out every moment of this gift of life. And in his 80s, Kushner writes a love letter to the world. It's a letter I want to share with you this morning. He writes, Dear world, we've been through a lot together over the past 8 decades, you and I. Marriages, births, deaths, fulfillment and disappointment, war and peace, good times and hard times. There were days when you were more generous to me than I possibly could have deserved. And there were days in which you cheated me out of things I felt I was entitled to. There were days in which you looked so achingly beautiful that I could hardly believe you were mine. And days where you broke my heart and reduced me to tears. But with it all, world, I choose to love you. I love you whether you deserve it or not, and how does one measure that? I love you in part because you're the only world I have. I love you because I like who I am better when I do. But mostly I love you because loving you makes it easier for me to be grateful for today and hopeful about tomorrow. Love does that. Faithfully yours, Harold Kushner. You can hardly summarize a man's life in 3 lessons, but with humility and deep reverence for this rabbi, I pray that we will choose to look for the godliness, to look for the divinity within human connection. I pray that we will remember God's eagerness for each and every one of us to slow down so our souls can be restored. But finally, perhaps the most important, I pray that we remember the antidote to fear is none other than love. Rabbi Kushner, you have been a blessing. You are a blessing. May you rest in peace. Shabbat shalom.